Yedlin lecture. This lecture is sponsored by the Jewish Studies program at the University of Alberta, along with the YIVO Institute for Austrian and Central European Studies. It's part of a week-long set of activities featuring various lectures on topics relating to Jewish history and culture. My name is Joseph Patridge, and I'm the director of the YIVO Institute for Austrian and Central European Studies. And I'm very pleased today to be able to welcome our speaker, Dr. Barbara Kirshenblatt-Gimblett. But before I introduce the speaker, I have a couple things to mention. First of all, I'd like to tell you that this presentation will be recorded. Also, I'd like to respectfully acknowledge that the University of Alberta is located on territory delineated by Treaty 6 of 1876 in the traditional lands of First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and other indigenous peoples. The Tova Yedlin lecture series is made possible by funds donated by Mrs. Deborah Yedlin and Mr. Martin Molyneux. It was endowed in November of 2007, and the purpose of the series is to present an annual lecture by a prominent scholar on the history of Central and Eastern European Jewry prior to the Holocaust. Dr. Yedlin was a longtime professor at the University of Alberta in what was then the Department of Slavic and East European Studies. She was born in the city of Rovne in interwar Poland, which we'll be hearing about in a few minutes. Rovne, as some of you may know, was a city of almost 50% Jewish population, and during the German occupation period from 1941 to 44 was the capital of German Ukraine, of the Reichskommissariat Ukraine. Dr. Yedlin was evacuated to the Volga region of the Soviet Union after the German invasion in 1941 and escaped the mass murder of Jews that took place there in that year. She immigrated to Canada in 1948, moving to Edmonton in 1950. She earned a Bachelor of Education, an MA, and a PhD from the University of Alberta, where she subsequently taught Russian literature and social intellectual history until her retirement in 1996. Her principal work was published in 1999. It's a political biography of the Russian author Maxim Gorky. Upon retirement, Dr. Yedlin actively engaged in building and supervising the Moshe Yedlin Memorial Library on Jewish Studies at the Beth Shalom Synagogue here in Edmonton. Our speaker today is Dr. Barbara Kirshenblatt-Gimblett, and she told me to keep the introduction short, but it's hard to do because this woman has done so much over a long career. She is the Ronald S. Lauder Chief Curator of the Poland Museum of the History of Polish Jews Core Exhibition and University Professor Emerita and Professor Emerita Performance Studies at New York University. Her writings and curatorial work have covered a broad variety of topics. I remember I met her originally when she was president of the American Folklore Society, when we were both at a National Endowment of the Humanities folklore seminar at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. But she's also worked as a curator, has multiple publications, which I will not mention all here, but I do want to mention a couple of them. For example, her book, They Called Me Meyer Julie, Painted Memories of a Jewish Childhood in Poland Before the Holocaust, may be of interest to those of you at today's lecture. She's also published books such as The Art of Being Jewish in Modern Times and Anne Frank Unbound, Media, Imagination, and Memory. Without further ado, please allow me to welcome this year's Tova Yedlin lecturer, Dr. Barbara Kirshenblatt-Gimblett. Dr. Kirshenblatt-Gimblett, the floor, as it were, is yours.
Thank you very, very much. I would like to begin by thanking the Yedlin family for supporting this lecture and to say how delighted I am to have been invited to do so. I also want to thank Joseph Patridge for inviting me. We have been negotiating for many years, and I was so looking forward to coming to Edmonton. I am a Toronto girl, and I've never been really out west, as they say, and I had hoped to come, and I hope there'll be another opportunity. I also want to thank Rochelle Wright, who has been facilitating our session today, and also Sylvia Hrobach. And so thank you all for making today possible. And so without further ado, I'm going to share my screen and we are going to begin. Just give me a moment here. I'm going to share my screen. Let's see where we are. Here we go. Okay. So my topic is coming of age Jewish youth in Poland between the wars. And we have extraordinary material for exploring this topic. And I'd like to begin by establishing where we are and when we are. The period we're going to be talking about is the period of the Second Polish Republic, and that is the period of the 1920s and 30s. Those of you who know your history of the region will know that Poland disappeared from the map of Europe between 1795 and World War I. And it was only after, at the end of World War I, that Poland became an independent country. And this is what the borders of Poland looked like during the 1920s and 30s. And as you can see, Vilna was in Poland, and the places that are in Poland today, like Wrocław, formerly Breslau, were not. And so the borders were completely changed after World War II. So this is the territory that we're looking at. And I'd like to point out a couple of spots on this territory. So first of all, Vilna is a very important location for us. We're going to be talking a lot about Vilna, but also in this area here, we're going to be talking about Opatów, which is the town my father came from. So my father is from what is today South Central Poland. Here it's Southwestern Poland. My mother is from Brest-Litovsk. Vilna is the site of many of the youth autobiographies that we'll be talking about. So this is the place, in the 1920s and 30s is the period. Now, we have an absolutely extraordinary resource for exploring the topic of what it was like to grow up and come of age in interwar Poland and the Second Polish Republic in the 1920s and 30s. And that is because the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research, which was located in Vilna, was established in 1925, and it didn't move to New York until after the Germans invaded Poland in 1939. But in those 20 years, in those actually more like 15 years in Poland, they did extraordinary work. And for a variety of reasons, which I'll explain, they ran a series of 3 autobiography contests, youth autobiography contests in the 1930s. And they beginning around, well, the last one was 1939, and believe it or not, the results of that contest were supposed to be announced on September 1st, 1939, which was the day the Germans invaded Poland. So as a result of these contests, hundreds of youth autobiographies, Jewish youth autobiographies, were collected. They were mailed to the YIVO in Vilna. And I'll say a little bit more about them, but you can see some samples here, and some of these young people, they really took a lot of pride, and they decorated the cover. So this is mein Lebensbeschreibung, geschrieben speziell von Konkurs von YIVO in Vilna. My life description, written specially for the competition, the contest that YIVO of YIVO in Vilna. And then at the bottom, my Autobiographies, so my autobiography. And here, and this one is, you can see one is from the contest in 1933, many are from the contest in 1939, and there was one that was a little bit earlier, also in the 30s. Now, what was the impetus for this contest? I mean, why run contests for youth autobiographies, Jewish youth autobiographies? Well, the impetus for it was Max Weinreich. Now, Max Weinreich was a fascinating figure. He was by training a philologist and a linguist, but his interests were much broader, and he was very, very devoted to Jewish life in Poland. And he actually believed, really until the very end, until the late 30s, that there was a future for Jews in Poland. And he was very worried about young people, because he was worried that young Jews were disillusioned, had lost hope in the future, were, if you will, floundering, and he wanted to understand them. He felt that only if he could understand youth, that youth were the future, and only if he could understand what made them tick, could the Jewish community do what had to be done to engage them, give them hope, and create a future with them and for them and by them. So as a result, and also he was one of the founders of the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research in Vilna, which was dedicated to the study of all aspects of the history and culture of East European Jews, and especially in the Yiddish language. And so, um, this was very important for him. Now we have to add one additional element, and that is among his various and sundry interests, and they were really wide ranging, even though he was first and foremost a person who studied the Yiddish language, was psychoanalysis. He himself had been psychoanalyzed, and both Sigmund Freud and Albert Einstein were on the honorary board of the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. And he actually translated Freud into Yiddish. Now, I was looking for his Yiddish translation of Freud's lectures on psychoanalysis, and I wasn't able to find it, but I did find Mordechai Schechter's analysis of the Yiddish that Max Weinreich used in creating this translation of Freud, because you can imagine that there was plenty of new terminology, even in German, and Weinreich needed to find a way to express these new words in Yiddish. So what's critically important here is his psychoanalytic interest, that he had been psychoanalyzed and he was interested in psychoanalysis. Now, there was another additional element, and that is that Freudian psychoanalysis had really focused on the first 5 years of life. I think Freudian psychoanalysis was premised on the idea that those were the formative years and that all else followed. And as a result, there was a field that had been neglected. And the neglected field was a psychoanalytic approach to adolescence. And the pioneer of the psychoanalytic approach to adolescence was Siegfried Bernfeld, who was based in Vienna. And what's so fascinating is that in this period, the study of youth, the study of the psychology of youth, and the study of youth culture was really active, very active, and it was very, very interdisciplinary. The psychologists were interested, the sociologists were interested. And in part, I think they were interested because it was a period of youth movements and of political movements that were mobilizing youth, whether it was Hitler Jugend or Zionist youth. Every movement had its youth movement. And so this mobilizing of youth created a very kind of interesting field for study. And from the study of youth, particularly the study of adolescence, arises what I would call interdisciplinary Jewish social science that brings together sociology, anthropology, ethnography, psychology, that brings together all these fields. It becomes a very, very interesting area. So Max Weinreich goes to Vienna and he meets Siegfried Bernfeld. And he says, I'm interested in the psychological and specifically psychoanalytic study of Jewish youth. And Bernfeld says, I'm going to give you my entire archive, all the work that I've done on the study of Jewish youth, obviously in German-speaking lands. And Weinreich takes this material back to Vilna. Now, Weinreich was fortunate enough to get a fellowship from the Rockefeller Foundation to spend a year at Yale. And he was interested in going to Yale because of this extraordinary individual, Edward Sapir, a Jew who came from a Yiddish-speaking home, and who was a very gifted linguist who also even wrote to some degree about Yiddish. And he was really a pioneering figure in what was developing in America at the time, which was the field of personality and culture. And he had a very strong psychoanalytic bent as well. So Weinreich now spends a year at Yale, and he is introduced to the field of culture and personality and the psychoanalytic approach within that. Now, there's yet another influence, and that is the great Polish sociologist Florian Danielski. Florian Danielski spent some time in America as well, working with William Thomas, and they wrote a landmark book called The Polish Peasant in Europe and America, a monograph on an immigrant group based on what are called I documents, personal documents. So in other words, in this period, partly because of the psychoanalytic interest, but there are other reasons as well, sociologists, psychologists, anthropologists are very interested in what we would call today personal documents, letters, memoirs, autobiographies, oral histories. In other words, when individuals talk about themselves. And this book about the Polish peasants in Europe and America was based on an extraordinary collection of letters and on one very long and exceptional autobiography. And this was really within a tradition within Poland of running contests to get people to respond by independently writing their own autobiographies or their own diaries or their own memoirs. And in part, it was a way of dealing with a lack of resources where you couldn't create, I would say, a kind of a research team that would be professionally trained and go out into the countryside and do, professional, academically trained interviews. So when you can't do that, you can run, it's like crowdsourcing. You can run a big contest and you can collect hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these personal documents. And that was the inspiration for Max Weinreich. So Max Weinreich comes back from Vienna, and he's got this wonderful youth culture archive from Siegfried Bernfeld. He comes back from Yale, and he's all equipped to think about personality and culture and a psychoanalytic approach. He is very familiar with Danielski's work and the Polish sociological tradition of running contests to collect autobiographies. So what does he do? He had already started, even before he went to Yale, he runs these 3 contests, and these autobiographies start to come in. Now, not all of them have these wonderful, wonderful covers, and they're just incredible. And basically, most of them are anonymous. Either these young writers are usually between the ages of about maybe 14, 15, 16, and maybe 20, 21. So they're really adolescents, although what adolescence means in interwar Poland, these are people that are already, some of them have finished primary school, they're already working. So it's not quite how we imagine adolescence today, which is one of the most interesting things about them. But here on the right, it says, Ich will nicht sterben, I don't want to die. And then it's, and many of them were anonymous. Some of them used initials, some of them provided their name, and some of them even provided a photograph of themselves, which I think is quite extraordinary. Now, we don't know the fate of the hundreds of youth who wrote and submitted these autobiographies. We don't know if they, who survived. We assume that most of them did not survive, but this very, very exceptional one on the right, she actually survived. And this autobiography was discovered among YIVO materials that were never returned to New York. They were still in Vilnius, and they were just very, very recently found. And this particular autobiography is still in Vilnius. And of course, it's been digitized, and YIVO has added it to its collection. So now let's have a look at some of these autobiographies and see what these young people had to say. So first of all, some of them were so poor that they wrote to YIVO and said, I don't have enough money for the postage to mail the autobiography to Vilna. And of course, for each contest, there were prizes. The prizes were usually a book that YIVO had published, often a quite scholarly book. But I think that this approach, which was YIVO's Sammler approach, the approach of mobilizing the masses to collect material for YIVO, and to do so, YIVO would send out questionnaires, and they would say, just to ordinary people, these are people that don't have any higher education. Here's a questionnaire, go around your town, collect this information, send it to us. It might be about place names, about nicknames, about Purim customs, or it might be write us, if you're an adolescent, write us your autobiography and mail it to us. So here's an example of the envelope in which RJ's autobiography arrived to YIVO, and YIVO saved the envelopes. They actually saved the materials. So I've chosen two autobiographies to share with you because they reflect I would say, polar opposites of the experiences of these young people, but at the same time, they tell us a lot about what it was like to be a young person in Poland at the time. So this is Esther. And here's a page, this is a page from Esther's diary, which she wrote in Yiddish, and to her credit, she wrote it in a very nice, neat, clear hand. And then she begins, as so many do, Ich bin geboren in Jahr 1920. I was born in 1920. And I'll give you a little bit of a sample of what she writes. I was born in 1920 into a strict Hasidic family. As far back as I can remember, I was steeped in Hasidic traditions. When I was 5, a woman named Sarah Schneers, so that's 1925, came to town. Her arrival caused an upheaval. People said that she was establishing schools for Jewish girls. The word school was magic to me. I envisioned a paradise. Imagine to be able to learn knowledge. I kept asking whether they would teach us writing and arithmetic. Father answered, first you will learn to pray, to write Yiddish, and translate the prayers. And when he told me that we would also study the Bible, it took my breath away. A Bes Yankiv school for girls was founded. I was an excellent student. In the school, I experienced my happiest moments as a child. Finally, I was able to study. After 2 years in Bes Yankiv, I started to think about public school. Father didn't like the idea of my going to a school where boys and girls studied together, but finally, Father promised me that I could go to public school, but on one condition only. The Bes Yankiv school was to come first. So now, what's going on here? First of all, 90% of Jewish children in the interwar years went to Polish public schools. They were the first generation to go to Polish public schools. My father went to a Polish public school, and he went to a cheder after school. The girls well, it wasn't that girls weren't educated, but girls didn't have the opportunities that boys had. They didn't have yeshivas. They didn't have the same kind of cheders, although eventually there were also some, variety of cheder, but basically they did not have what you would call really well-organized, religious girls did not have well-organized formal education, Jewish education for them. And so it was revolutionary that Sarah Schneers should establish these Bes Yankiv schools. And they were really modern. They didn't just study Jewish subjects. They studied science and history and language. They were really, and she had a teachers academy as well. She trained teachers for these schools, and she formed hundreds of them across the length and breadth of independent Poland. And these schools continue to this day in South Africa, in Israel, in North America. So this was really, really revolutionary. And it was extraordinary that her father agreed that she would be able to, that he would allow her to go to the Polish public school. But you can see how totally and utterly excited she was, how much yearning there was on the part of these young Jewish girls that they would have the opportunity to actually be properly, formally educated. So, and then of course she's reading, needless to say. So this is extraordinary. pupils of the Besyankov ultra-Orthodox girls' school in her town, in Gryets, with their mothers and teachers. And so you get a sense these are religious women, modest, wearing wigs and hats, and the girls themselves. And it's really this was revolutionary. You know, this is, I would say, this is what you might call defensive modernization, which is to modernize within the tradition. And the excitement of this young woman, of Esther, really tells you how revolutionary it was, and also how extraordinarily successful it was. So now let's go to the other end of the spectrum. Let's go to Jakob Harafuller, which I think is extraordinary, actually, that he provides his name. She's just Esther. He gives you his name. He writes in Polish, not in Yiddish. And some of these autobiographies were also written in Hebrew. And this is really I would say, the memoir of a young Jew. And then he has a few kind of preliminary remarks, but you'll see how different, but also how revealing is his autobiography. They all start, I was born on 15th of March, 1921. So he too, I think, would have probably entered the mid 30s or 39 contest. I'm not sure. My name is Jakob. I'm the oldest child in my family. I have 2 brothers, 2 sisters. We live in a dark room where the filth makes me cringe, although there's nothing I can do about it. My brother and I work at home with our father. We earn our living by sitting at machines making baby shoes. I don't have a mother. She died when I was 14. And during the first period of my life, we lived in a garret over my grandmother's kitchen on a street inhabited by poor, simple people and by the dregs of society. My friend and I collected cigarette boxes. And then he goes on about this really very, very, very impoverished childhood. Now, I should say that the instructions for the competition stress the importance of introspection. And so when Weinreich created the guidelines for the competition, he said, I'm not interested in your political opinions, because all of them were very engaged in politics. I don't want to hear about I don't want to hear about politics. I want to know what you're thinking. I want to know what you're feeling. I want to know about your inner life. Now, of course, they're telling you a lot of things, but Esther, she did communicate how she was feeling, that she was excited, that she felt joy, happiness. So she is. Here, we're just getting started. So now he's telling you about all of these kinds of things. Then he says, when I was 3, and I went to Cheder, and that, of course, is what you're seeing here, this very traditional school for boys. And this is actually not so traditional because they're already at benches and not sitting around the table in the home of the melamed, of the teacher. So I went to Cheder for young boys. The teacher listened to us chant the Bible, and on the wall behind our teacher were colorful portraits of Aaron and Moses. The Bible was my first intellectual and spiritual source of inspiration. Studying it prompted vivid fantasies and awoke a strong sense of Jewishness in me. So, of course, Weinreich would have been very happy with this more sort of introspective aspect. I saw Adam and Eve, the sunny land of Palestine. This instilled in me a faith in my existence and in God's existence, a faith in everything that religion proclaimed. Then he talks about the holidays and Simchas Torah and all kinds of actually quite positive memories. And then he says, education opened my eyes, awoke me from a religious dream, from the wonderful age-old poetry of my people, and converted me to realism. So what I find fascinating about this autobiography is that you can see these transformative moments even in the very short period of somebody who is probably, if he's born in 21, so 21, 31, so let's say he's 17 or 18 years old when he's writing this. This is, he's a young person. And even in this short period of time, he's going from abject poverty, cheder, from the age of 3, the Bible, faith in God, religious feelings, memories of these holidays, to being awoken from a religious dream and converted to realism. How did that happen? What happened? Well, as he goes into adolescence, he joins a youth organization, and specifically a Zionist one. So what's happening in these towns is there's lots of youth organizations. Every Zionist group has a youth organization. Mizrahi has for religious kids, and Beitar for the revisionists, and the labor Zionists have theirs. So he joins a youth organization that stood for Fearless Struggle for Justice. This is a long way from Cheder. And he says, this was the most important period of my life. I found enlightenment. So the youth organization puts him in this is not the Cheder, that puts him in a completely different universe. And then he says, the meetings, distributing of leaflets, hanging of posters, flags, mass assemblies, all this shaped my intellect. I can't describe the feelings that I had on camping trips and outings. All this had a positive effect on me. The way I related to other people, especially girls, changed radically. At one time, other people made me uncomfortable. I wasn't sociable, and I didn't have any manners. Now, all at once, I'd clearly changed. So the idea that within this very short period of his life, he would undergo such a radical transformation, and that it was not in this instance, it wasn't school. It wasn't like with Esther, with the Besyankov school. In this instance, it was this youth group. And you can see why Bernfeld would be so interested in youth culture and these youth groups, and also why Max Weinreich would find them so interesting. Now, how does he end the autobiography? He ends it. I am a poor assimilated fellow. I'm a Jew and a Pole, or rather, I was a Jew, but under the influence of the environment, language, and culture, I evolved into a Pole. So now he went from Cheder to a Zionist youth group, and now he's evolved into a Pole. But what's so incredible is that there are all these options. What you're seeing is the diversity of Jewish life in interwar Poland. You're seeing interwar Poland as a living laboratory for possible Jewish futures. And you're seeing an individual, a young person, trying them all out. Now, I don't know, when, 5 years later, 10 years later, where he'll evolve into. I've evolved into a Pole. I love Poland, but I don't love the Poland that hates me for no reason. I hate the Poland that doesn't want me as a Pole and sees me only as a Jew, that wants to chase me out of the country in which I was born and raised. That Poland I hate. I hate its anti-Semitism. I don't know what I am, a Pole or a Jew or a Pole. I want to be a Pole, but you won't let me. I want to be a Jew, but I can't. I've moved away from Jewishness. Poland rejects me as a Jew and only a Jew, treating me like a foreigner. I look around and see that Poland isn't mine, and I can't be free here. The most ignorant lout who doesn't possess even a fraction of my knowledge of Polish culture can wound my human dignity, taunt me, and punch me in the face simply because I was born a Jew. I started taking an interest in the Zionist movement. I can imagine the journey to Palestine, the land of my dreams. I can see myself walking behind a plow with a rifle on my shoulder, with a free heart, a free gait, and a proud, peaceful gaze. What is going on here? I can imagine Max Weinreich was in his glory. He's got a gold mine here. Here, this young man has taken all of the options, put them into one paragraph, communicated all of his confusion and his experience. I mean, it is just absolutely phenomenal. So this gives you a feeling of the richness of these autobiographies for these I, as in, the letter I, me, documents, these personal documents. This gives you the most extraordinary insight into their experience. So now, what did Weinreich do with this material? Well, you would have expected that he would have surveyed it, coded it, analyzed it and come to some conclusions. But no, actually, his associate, Kligsberg, did do a kind of sociological analysis of this material, but Weinreich did not. Weinreich did something else. He wrote a book which he published in 1935. This was before he even had the results of the 1939 contest. And the book is called Der Weg zu unserer Jugend, The Way to Our Youth, Jesuitis, Methoden, Problemen von jiddischer Jugendforschung. The Way to Our Youth, the Foundations, Methods, Problems of Jewish Youth Research. He wrote, indeed, he wrote a book of methodology. And in this book, he identified a kind of duality of, or set of problems that is perfectly captured in the last paragraph of the autobiography that we were just looking at, of all of the dilemmas of identification, rejection, of a kind of double, if you will, double deficit. And he, in essence, wrote a book of a methodology of how to study this material. And but he himself never actually did. So what we have are hundreds of these autobiographies. But how come, if the Germans invaded on September 1st, 1939, how is it that we have this material? Well, on the left, you are seeing the YIVO's paper brigade, as they came to be known. And that is, Vilna Jews were moved into the Vilna ghetto, and the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research was outside, their building was outside the ghetto. And so some of the YIVO archivists, librarians, and scholars were recruited by the Germans, and they were told to go through YIVO's collections and sort out what was valuable so that the Germans could confiscate that material and then take it and keep it and do whatever they were going to do with it. And what this paper brigade did was they smuggled valuable material in their clothes, and any way they could, smuggled valuable material into the ghetto, and they used other methods to hide this material so as to save it. And of course, you see on the left, they have their carriage, or it's not really a wheelbarrow, but this vehicle, so to speak, where they are moving the YIVO materials. And on the right, you can see the Germans going through YIVO's treasures. However, after the war, the materials were actually found, and they were crated up, and they were sent to New York, and they arrived at YIVO. And you can imagine that the day they arrived at YIVO and the boxes were opened, what that must have been like. And since then, a lot of material has been found in Vilnius, where it remains today. And YIVO has an arrangement with the National Library in Vilnius to digitize that material and to, in a digital form, bring together all of YIVO's collections. And since the work on the autobiographies have gone forward, we've actually published English translations of them, Polish translations of them, and Hebrew ones as well, and also published them in their original languages. And so if you're interested in reading a selection of the autobiographies, that is to say the whole autobiography, but only several of them, I recommend Awakening Lives. I want to turn now to my second case, and that is the extraordinary autobiographies that Max Weinreich collected, and that he collected because, among other things, he collected, if you will, within the framework of a psychoanalytic approach. He wanted to understand the inner life of Jewish youth growing up in the 1920s and 30s in Poland, and their struggle with their identity, with their lives, their future, with their despair, with their options, with their choices. That's what he wanted to understand. And that's why he wanted them to write about themselves, but especially about how they were feeling and thinking about themselves and their situation. And they were writing in real time. They were writing about themselves in that very moment. Of course, they would, I was born in a certain year and I grew up and my childhood. But the real heart and soul of these autobiographies are really about their adolescence, about who they are and what they're experiencing in real time. Now, I had the extraordinary opportunity to interview my father, and he was born in 1916. He left Poland when he was about 17 in 1934, and he was the right age to have written such an autobiography because the two that I showed you were not born in 1920 and 21. And so if he had entered the 1933 contest, he would have been 14, 17. He would have been 17 years old. He could easily have entered the contest. But knowing him as I do, there's no way he would ever have written an autobiography that would have explored his inner workings. When he was already quite advanced in years and he suffered from depression, and we finally convinced him to go to a psychiatrist or a psychologist, he refused. He said they're witch doctors. He absolutely refused. And finally he went, but he had absolutely zero interest in exploring anything like what those autobiographers in the YIVO contest explored. But he did something else, and that is well, first of all, he's born in 1916 in Opatów, Opt in Yiddish. He got 7 years. He completed Polish public school, 7 years. And of course, he went to a cheder, to a Jewish after school, to three different ones: a traditional one, a so-called modern one, where my grandmother, his mother, established the Tarbut school in their town, but he was already too far beyond it to go to the Zionist school. So he went to a cheder, and he began working right after he finished the 7 grades of public school. He apprenticed to an electrician, he apprenticed to a shoemaker, and then he left when he was 17 for Canada, for Toronto, where I was born in 1942. So I began interviewing him in 1967, and I did it because I was doing a survey for the Canadian National Museum in Ottawa for their Center for Folk Cultural Research. I did they were doing surveys of immigrant groups in Canada, and folklore surveys of what culture do they bring with them, and what do they retain, and did they create any new traditions. And I offered to do a survey of Yiddish folklore in Toronto. And I started by interviewing my family, and then I moved out to the wider community. And what I discovered was that my father, instead of being introspective, he was what I call extrospective. I don't know that that's a word in the English language, but it's the only way I can describe him. So if you asked him how he feels, he wouldn't talk to you. But if you asked him to describe how to make a shoe, he would describe it in minute detail for half an hour. So when I began interviewing him, and I discovered that when I didn't understand something and I asked him to explain it to me, he would make drawings in my notebook. And these drawings, and also he would, well, I'll explain this in a moment. He'd make drawings in my notebook, and he had a prodigious memory. That I interviewed him for more than 40 years, from 1967 to 2009, when he died at the age of 93. And I recorded those interviews, and I still have questions that I wish I could ask him. We could have continued for another 40 years. So I would say that he knew who he was by the way in which he engaged the world around him, rather than being introspective about what was going on psychologically inside. That's the only way that I can somehow rather go about this. So in other words, number one, he would never have entered the contest. And number two, if he had entered the contest and delivered what he gave me in the interviews, Max Weinreich would have been very disappointed, or rather, he would have sent the material to the ethnographic section of YIVO and not the youth culture section. So what happened was that when my father was 59, he had a serious illness, and he was worried that he might get sick. He got better, but he might get sick again, and my mother would be stuck with the business. So he retired. He sold the business and retired. And then he got well, and he was a young man. 59, 60 is very, very young to retire, especially years ago. And he was at loose ends. And so I knew that he was very visual. He had a paint wallpaper and floor covering store, and he had made a living starting out in Canada as a house painter. And then he had his own paint store. And I knew that he was a visual, had a visual memory, but I also knew that he had some kind of an artistic flair. And I absolutely knew that he could paint what he remembered. So for 10 years, my mother campaigned, my husband's an artist, campaigned, I campaigned. We gave him paintbrushes, we gave him acrylics, paper, easel, canvas, everything, and he refused. One day my mother came home from the Jewish Community Center, and she said to him, "I've signed you up for art classes and they don't give refunds." And so he had no option but to go to the life drawing class and a still life class. And after one or two sessions, he said, "It's impossible. Even though it was a nude model, no way." And the life drawing class was hopeless. So he actually finally relented. And we said to him, "Just paint what you remember, give it a shot, try it." And he did. So I want to share with you what childhood looks like from an extrospective perspective. The autobiographies from YIVO were from an introspective perspective, although there were some details about what I would call the world around them, but this is the exact opposite. This is completely extrospective. So first of all, Meyer introduces himself. "I was named after my great-grandfather, Meyer Machel Gutmacher. Everybody in town had a nickname. Like it was like the big Meyer, the little Meyer, Meyer the goose carcass, don't ask me why. Mine was Meyer Tammuz, Meyer July, because July was the hottest month of the year. Meyer Tammuz means crazy Meyer. People get excited when it's hot, and I was an excitable kid." Now, he gives me easily, I don't know how many pages of stories based on this painting alone. He describes everything he's wearing: the hat, the collar, the jacket, the +4s, the 2 pairs of white socks, the ski boots, the brass eyelets, the yellow shoelaces. There's a whole story that goes from the hat to the shoes. And then there's a whole story about that herring. He calls the painting Boy with a Herring, about how you can make a meal for a whole family of 10 people, kids, parents, out of that herring. The detail, and in other words, I would say this is what finally emerged, because he started painting when he was 73. He is completely self-taught, and he painted for 20 years. And what happened was that the storytelling that he basically gave me in the first 20 years that I interviewed him was only words and drawings in my notebook. But after he began painting, he started to actually narrate in a way that was complementary. It was a combination of visual narrative and verbal narrative. And this wasn't just a picture on the cover. This was one after the other. So I'm going to give you a sense of it, and then I'll conclude and we'll open up for questions. So this is, I've selected, his paintings cover a broad range of subjects, but I've selected specifically the ones that are really focused on his childhood as such. One of his most favorite things to do was to run around the town with a hoop, and with this little wire handle that he made out of a piece of wire. And he calls this Boy with a Hoop, and he appears in almost all of his paintings in exactly the same outfit that you see here. Here he is again, and you'll see him as he's like a Where's Waldo. He's like a little figure and you'll see him in umpteen different paintings. And the town itself was 10,000 people, with maybe about 6,500 were Jewish, and it was a real town with a marketplace and a market, but it was small enough that a kid could just run around freely, which he loved to do. Here he is as a very young boy running after the flower porter, and he used to taunt the flower porter, and he used to love to watch everything going on in the town. And so he then made me a panorama of the town from the ancient town gate on the right to the World War I monument on the left with the pump, and all of the major buildings in the town kind of compressed into a panorama, not unlike the ones that we know from the medieval period and the early modern period. It's exactly the same sort of same kind of town, same kind of panorama. So market day was for him it was better than the circus, although he loved the circus too, because all the peasants came from around the area, and the town prostitute in red on the right. The Jews brought out all of their wares, they opened their shops, the peasants brought their livestock, their eggs, their produce, and of course the thieves were there, and all the tricks that they played. And so he has many, many stories that are all connected with market day. But even in a little town of 10,000 people in Poland, the circus came through, the traveling circus came through, and he loved the circus. And on the left, you can see the kids climbing, getting in for free, sneaking in under the curtain, and also the circus procession, where they would actually announce their arrival with their beautiful wagons and their animals. And he describes in detail the trained dogs, the horses, the everything about the circus, which of course you can imagine was very, very wonderful. Then the of course the interior of the synagogue, which was wonderfully painted, and he is here as one of the choir boys for the high holidays. And he narrates it, the women's section, the 12 tribes of Israel, the signs of the zodiac, the Wailing Wall, Rachel's tomb, the spies and the grapes, the Polish style central bema, and this was a masonry synagogue, and all the tricks the kids played, because he was a prankster, he was a naughty boy, and all of the jokes, the tricks, the pranks, including ones that are connected with this synagogue holiday. Well, then he proceeded, he would tell me, this is at the top of this street, at the corner of that street. I said, you know what? I'm completely confused. So I made a list of all the places that he mentioned, and I said, make me a map, which he did. This is his map of the town, marking the places that he had told me about. The very first painting he made was the painting of the kitchen, because he knew that I was very, very interested in food. I was very interested in the kitchen. And this is one of his very, very, I think maybe the first painting itself. And when he became a house painter, he wanted to get extra skills, and he went to night school to learn how to do wood graining, to fake wood. And in his paintings, you'll see a kind of a crazy, I would say an extravaganza of wood graining, because he knows how to do it. But he was in the paint and wallpaper business, and these are stenciled walls. He remembers exactly how the walls were stenciled each year, because wallpaper was so expensive. And he studied the violin, and it was a two-room house. This was the first one-room home that his family had when his brother was born. And the stories that are attached to this have to do with the special rechenke, special cake, with the key on the chair put under the mother's back to open the womb so the baby will come out more easily, the midwife, the amulets to ward off Lilith, who was Adam's first wife, and steals baby boys before they're circumcised, because she wouldn't lie beneath Adam, and she was expelled from the garden. And then incredible stories. This is like from Diderot. I swear it's from the 18th century Diderot Encyclopedia, where he presents a scene in this way. This is the shoemaker, all of his tools, the whole process of making shoes. And in this case, the family and the workshop were all in one place. A story of a shoemaker whose sons, every time a son was born, the son died, and he only had 7 daughters. So he went to the rabbi and said, what am I going to do? I don't have a son. They all die at birth, and nobody will say the Kaddish, the prayer for the dead, when I'm gone. And I have to come up with 7 dowries for my 7 daughters. And so the rabbi said to him, next time the boy is born, wrap him in white, have him always wear white. So when the angel of death comes to get him, they'll see that he's wrapped in white. They'll think it's a burial shroud, that he's already dead. And here's an amulet, a blessed coin. Let him wear that and he will survive. And he did survive. And when my father left Opatów in 1934, the boy's about 14. He was still dressed in white. And then after the war, those who survived and came back and told my father what had happened said that during the Great Deportation of all the Jews of Opatów to Treblinka, this boy was in that Great Deportation and he was murdered in Treblinka and did not survive. So, here you have in one painting, you have this extraordinary story about this family, about this boy, and about the shoemaker and the whole process of making shoes. Because he then also, provides diagrams of the shoemaking. This is the cheder. This is the traditional cheder, not like the one that we saw from one of the autobiographers where they're sitting at benches. And then, of course, this is the so-called modern cheder. So even in his time, of course, this was a kind of a sequence that he went through. And he belonged to a Zionist youth group, very much like what was described by one of our autobiographers. He was a very bad boy. He was locked up in the cheder overnight. He always had a rope tied around his waist. His friends would go home and say to his mother, Meyer misbehaved. He's locked up in the cheder overnight. She would arrive with a basket. He would lower the rope, and then the basket would come up. He played palant, which was a little bit like, stickball, where you hit one stick with another stick, and it's a little bit like baseball, but I think we would think of it more like stickball. So there are lots of games. His friends said that they waited for May, like they were waiting for the Messiah, because the May dew and the beautiful weather in May was something they prized, and they used to like to sit outside the Christian cemetery early in the morning and read and just hang out together. So this is his childhood. It's swimming along the mossy slope of the Opatówka River. It's in the orchard, and you can see that these kids are even making out. This is very, very uncensored. On a Saturday afternoon, they go to the orchard and there's a swing. And so all of these things that are childhood things, the winter of sledding down one of the steeper streets in the town, and of course the bicycle, which was very, 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 very prized. And so I think with that, I'm going to stop sharing the screen and just make a couple of concluding remarks, and we'll then open to questions. So what I've shown you very quickly and very much in brief are two very different approaches to reporting on what it was like to grow up in Poland during the 1920s and 30s. One in real time that was by request introspective, and the other decades later, an adult remembering decades later what it was like to grow up. So that's the first contrast in the two accounts, because you have in the ones that are the YIVO autobiographies, there is a kind of a vividness or urgency in the emotions. That is, Esther is I was overjoyed. I was so excited, and she's expressing the feeling she's having then at the moment. In the case of Meyer, looking back, well, first of all, they are introspective, and he is, as I characterize him, extrospective, which means that, I like to say that I got the right father and he got the right daughter. I'm trained as a folklorist, as an ethnographer, and so actually I'm pretty extrospective myself. And I was myself probably much more interested in his extrospection than I would be in his introspection. And so his And his memory, I think that his capacity to remember decades later, to be 90 years old and to be remembering 70 years, 75 years earlier, and to be remembering everything, not just about his childhood, not just about, following the flower porter or running around the town with a hoop or his bicycle or his dog, or not just the so-called the childhood things. He remembered everything about the town. He remembered the brush makers, the blacksmith, the butchers, the kosher slaughterers, all the holidays, everything to do with market day. There was not a topic that I put before him. I said, tell me about the first car. Tell me about electricity. Tell me about water. Tell me about, the church, the priest. I could put any topic in front of him and he remembered. And what he remembered, I think he literally, for him, the town was a memory palace. He would, in his memory, in his mind's eye, and he eventually did a painting this way, he would, in his mind's eye, walk up and down the marketplace and remember shop by shop by shop, and then who lived above the store, one after the other after the other. And then he eventually did a painting that was exactly that. So there was a way that once he started, like life cycle, birth through death. I have marvelous stories and paintings that have to do with the cemetery and all the customs associated with death, or the calendar year, Rosh Hashanah all the way to Tisha B'Av, to the commemoration of the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, or how to make a shoe. He made me a diagram and then he described it in detail. And he was talking once to a survivor, Holocaust survivor friend from his town who was a shoemaker. And he said, listen, he says, I described to my daughter how to make a shoe. Here's what I told her. And he tells him in detail what he told me. And the guy who had been a shoemaker says, Meyer, from what you described, I would know how to make a shoe. So he had a prodigious memory 75 years later, but it was a memory that was extrospective because of his incredible curiosity about the world. He wasn't so curious about himself, he was curious about the world. And so what emerges from his memories is of a very different character, and it has also extraordinary value, and it is unbelievably, I would say, unique, especially because of the visual memory as well as the verbal memory, the storytelling, and also these descriptions of process. I mean, the descriptions of how to make a brush. Oh my goodness, if the description of how to make a shoe was detailed, how to make a brush, he made a panel with like a checkerboard in which he painted every single step in the making of a brush. So I think that these are just very, very different ways of accounting for what it means to come of age in Poland before the Holocaust. And now let's open it up to questions.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Barbara, for this insight into the childhood, the youth of people in Poland between the wars. There's a few questions that kind of coagulated, if I can say that, around a couple just themes of access. So maybe we could just start with those. Are these paintings that your father made available for everybody to see, or are these in your private collection, or are they public?
Okay, so first of all, I manage, you can imagine 40 years of recorded interviews is a lot of material. So I had the good fortune to be a fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies at the Hebrew University. And they provided an apartment, and I guess they assumed people with big families that had 4 bedrooms. Any event, I invited my parents to come and stay with me. Because then I figured, I can continue interviewing my father. I also interviewed my mother, I should say. She was great too. So there were 2 secretaries there, one for English and one for Hebrew. And everybody was using the Hebrew secretary. And they said, listen, nobody's using the English one. I said, okay, you know what? I have all these recordings. I've transcribed a lot, but there's a lot more. I'll let her transcribe them. If she can't handle the Yiddish, I'll manage the Yiddish when we get there. So all of a sudden, I had huge, huge transcriptions. And I started to assemble this vast material and started to organize it. And I realized we have a marvelous book. So I collaborated with when I put it together, of course, I put it together with the images because I wanted to treat it as not a text that is illustrated and not an album with captions, but a fully integrated visual, a fully integrated word image narrative where the words complement the image complements this, and where they complete each other, where not all the storytelling is done visually, not all the storytelling is done verbally, but when you put them together, you get the whole thing. And I started to interview him from the paintings as well. So we put together the book. The book is wonderful, and it's available on Amazon. And I highly recommend it. It's beautiful, and it would be a great Pesach gift, fabulous Hanukkah gift, if I may say so. And I shouldn't tell you this, but there are lots and lots of used copies that are very, very inexpensive, because if you buy it new, it's a beautiful, big, beautiful book with over 200 color illustrations. So we did a book. Then we also did an exhibition, and we exhibited the work at the Magnus Museum in Berkeley, at the Jewish Museum in New York, at the Jewish Historical Museum in Amsterdam. And my family has gifted the entire collection to Polin Museum of the History of Polish Jews in Warsaw. So the short answer to the question is, the book is available. The paintings all of them will be in Poland and Warsaw. We are creating a temporary exhibition that we hope will travel. There is a beautiful documentary film of my father returning to his hometown, where they exhibited his paintings in the county seat headquarters. What an experience that was. It was amazing. It's called Paint What You Remember is the title of the film. So there's a film, Paint What You Remember, and They Call Me Meyer July is the title of the book. And I think that's the answer. Oh, and then there's lots and lots on the web. If people are interested, when you send out a follow-up, I'll provide a link to what we have on the web.
Okay, I'm glad you mentioned that. I wanted to say to people that this has been recorded, and we will make it available on the website of the Worth Institute, and we can provide other information there too, and links to other information, for example, references to reading. Some people are writing in and asking about titles of the books or
absolutely.
whatever.
Yeah. I'll give you titles to Awakening Lives, They Call Me Meyer July, Image Before My Eyes, which is wonderful and a beautiful film, and lots on youth in it. Then this documentary film. So there's we'll provide some really, really nice material, also useful for teaching.
Some of you may remember a few years ago, the Worth Institute sponsored an exhibition of art by Nellie Toll, which was who was
great.
Also right. Also a very similar story. Actually, this was art that she had created while in hiding, right, from the Germans in Poland. I unfortunately just found out a couple of days ago that Nellie has passed away. So I'm sorry to have to report that. She came here for the exhibition. She talked with us. She answered questions. She came in person, right? Remember those days where people could come in person? She came in person, and she talked about her experiences and the art, and how she used the art at the time during the German occupation to survive, right? Kind of intellectually. And one other, just mention a reference to something we've done here that came up to my mind when I was listening to your presentation. We had a conference just 2 years ago at Pier 21, which is the Canadian Museum of Immigration in Halifax, and it was about Polish migration back and forth across the Atlantic. And one of the sources used by one of the papers was autobiographies, which were collected in one of these contests that you're talking about. Not this particular contest, but apparently these Polish autobiography contests are popular, right? And so we have another connection through the sources there of these autobiography.
Absolutely, and they do it, like, for example, miners. They wanted to get these memoirs and autobiography from miners. So yeah, absolutely.
And I see that in the chat, we put a link to the upcoming other Worth Institute Jewish Studies Week's activities, and you'll get the recordings and everything there. So let's go back to the questions and answers and see where we are. We have a greeting from Costa Rica, the Museo de la Comunidad Judía. Somebody there is saying hello. But Rose Gottlieb would like to know, how did these autobiographies build support for the Jewish youth resistance movements during World War II? And what do they reveal about those later movements? I guess anything.
You know, actually that really is an interesting topic. So I'm sure many of those who are listening know that there was an extraordinary project in the Warsaw Ghetto, the Oynig Shabbos Archive, which was a clandestine archive, an effort on the part of Emanuel Ringelblum to rally, I think around 60 volunteers who in secret documented everything. And the materials they collected are amazing, including a lot from youth groups in the Warsaw Ghetto. And those youth groups actually were pivotal to the organizing of the uprising. They, because they were young, they were brave, courageous, and what we know about them, in addition to personal documents, because there are all kinds of personal documents, they actually did underground press, and they printed their own newspapers, newsletters, and those materials survived because during the Great Deportation from the Warsaw Ghetto to Treblinka in the summer of 1942. There was the sense that, I mean, I think the Oynig Shabbos team really, what happened was that when they began working, they thought they were going to create an archive for when they survived after the war, and they would write a history of the Warsaw Ghetto. But then with the Great Deportation, they realized that they weren't going to survive, or the chances were very slim, and they wanted the archive to survive. So they packed the archive up into tin boxes and they buried it. And then in 1943, several weeks before the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, because at that point I think it was a deportation of more than 300,000 Jews to Treblinka, and there were about 60,000 Jews left in the Warsaw Ghetto. And at that point, it became a labor camp, and they knew that they were going to have the uprising, and they decided that they had to bury the rest of the archive. And they buried the rest of the archive in milk cans, tin boxes, and they were able to retrieve 2 caches. We think there's a third, but we're not sure. And so in those caches, in those tin boxes, and in those milk cans are these underground newspapers, newsletters, and a lot of them are from these youth groups. And these youth groups were absolutely instrumental in the organizing of the uprising. And they were very, very important, just generally, in what you would call, I mean, spiritual resistance is only part of it, but all the different ways in which Jews struggled to support each other, to survive, and to deal with this devastating situation.
We have just a praise about the story of your dad, and your fastidiousness and timidity is refreshing and special, from Israel Lakovsky. But Cheryl Cohen, not Linda Levenstein, said, "This is fascinating." I don't know what Linda Levenstein thought about it, but maybe she could tell us. Here, about a year ago, YIVO put out a request for volunteer translators for some Yiddish youth diaries. Is this group of diaries a part of your story? And why is it that YIVO's only working on them now?
No. YIVO, we've been working on these, YIVO's been working on the diaries forever. I mean, first of all, it was the 1935 book that Weinreich published. Then there was a sociologist, Klicksberg, who did a kind of coded a lot of the material, and then like a sociologist was able to somehow characterize the corpus. So he did that. Then Awakening Lives was published, and that's got to be, I don't know, 15 or 20 years ago. It's a while back. And since then, there have been dissertations, articles. Actually, there's been quite a bit of work done on them in Poland, in Israel, and also, of course, in the United States. As to the translations that this person was referring to, I'm not sure if are they diaries or are they autobiographies? That's the question. Diaries are written in real time, meaning day by day by day by day. These autobiographies are also, quote, in real time, but they're written all at once of a piece. I just want to just say a very warm welcome to Vilma from Costa Rica. Thank you very, very much for tuning in, all the way from Costa Rica. That's great.
I skipped over one by mistake. I'm sorry. With the realities of identity struggle, assimilation, and anti-Semitism, did any of the writings reveal anything about conversion to Catholicism as a way toward acceptance during this time?
You know, I'm not aware in the autobiographies that comes up, but there are hundreds of them. So who knows whether any of them might be like that final paragraph that I read where he says, I'm a Jew, I'm a Pole, but they won't accept me, but Palestine, I can walk free. You know, this is a kid that's like going in all directions, which is just, it's kaleidoscopic. But I actually think I actually believe that was the Jewish experience for many people in the interwar years, kaleidoscopic, because of so many options and so many choices. So clearly this would have been one. And I mean, one of the great tragedies of the many tragedies in the Warsaw Ghetto is that Jewish converts to Christianity were, of course, put in the ghetto. And there was a church in the ghetto, and there was a priest that came in to minister them. So from a Nazi perspective, they were Jews, and from their perspective, they were Christians. So it's just a very, it's a really complicated, it's a good question, a very, very complicated story. I see a question here about the availability of the autobiographies themselves. So I would say Awakening Lives is a great place to start because they've been translated into English and is a good introduction that really gives you a sense of how they were collected, why, what they're about. Then I think that there are some others that have appeared here and there, but what we'll do is we'll put that information into the message that we're going to send out. But thank you for your interest. We'll save the Q&A and be sure that we respond to as many questions as we can.
Well, one of the strengths of the presentation in my mind is that showing all the options available for these kids, right? And unfortunately, we will never know which path they ended up taking, many of them. But by stopping time in that moment where they're writing down these autobiographies, it really shows you the variety of possibilities that so many young people have, right? Which route would they have taken? So
right.
Which route did some of them take?
If I had originally planned to a third section to this talk, which was to show how we use these autobiographies at Polin Museum of the History of Polish Jews. And, but I thought that I just for myself, I wanted to give you much more depth of treatment of the YIVO autobiographies because I thought they were so revealing. But let me just say a word about that, because in the interwar year gallery, the gallery that deals with the period basically 1918 to 39, we divide it into three thematic areas: politics, culture, everyday life in small towns, and growing up. And we wanted the voice of this period to be the voice of youth. So we made these autobiographers our narrators in the exhibition. And so generally, but in the section on growing up, they are the voice. They are the voice. And it's really, if I had, well, it could be another talk, but intergenerational conflict, huge. But you even saw it with Esther. She said her father said, first you learn your prayers, you go to the Obesianka school, then you can go to that, Polish school. So and you can imagine with the boy, what are his parents thinking? He starts out in Cheder and he ends up in Palestine, but in between, he wants to be a Pole. I don't know what his parents are thinking, but I can assure you that wasn't their experience. So you have these wedding pictures that have all the generations in one image. And, you've got, clean shaven, no hat, and then you've got with a babushka and, like all very, religious attire on these older people. So the generational issues are there very strong in these autobiographies. Lots of generational issues. You've got then the great pride of the Jewish community was the school system, and education was huge. And so we have a whole section just on the Yiddish school system, the Hebrew school system, the religious school system, and the Jewish gymnasia, the Jewish high schools in Polish. So you had, that diversity is already institutionalized in the education system. And then we took, I think we had about 6 or 8 autobiographers from the collection, and we traced their paths. We particularly in terms of education, they start out, where do they start out? Polish public school? Did they go to a teacher's college? Did anybody get to university? Did they stop at the end of primary school? So for all of them, we have their paths. We know what the trajectory was, and we show it. So these, come to Warsaw, come to Polin Museum, visit the section on growing up, and really, it's really, really, really interesting. And the youth groups, which is how we end that section, the club, because the locale might just be a room. This was hugely important for these kids, huge, really huge. And the outings, like I think he said that that was the revolution in his life, that they had these outings. They would go, they would walk in the forest, they would visit historical monuments, they would do sports. It was in many ways, I mean, my father, it was a very rich childhood, extraordinary. He made all his own toys. He made me 21 toys. He showed me how to make them. It's just, I mean, what can I say? Come to Warsaw.
Well, that actually brings up a question that's in the question and answer. With the philosophies and anti-Semitism of the current Polish government, do you have any concerns about the safety of your museum gift?
Actually, I'm okay with it. I'll tell you how I see this. So Polin Museum, and at some point, if there's ever interest, I would love to talk about the museum itself. But it was established as a private-public partnership. It was initiated by a Jewish NGO in Poland. It was initiated by the Association of the Jewish Historical Institute of Poland, a Jewish NGO established in 1951. So they carried the project from an idea in 1993, just 4 years after the fall of communism, until the museum was formally founded in 2005. And when it was founded in 2005, it was founded as a partnership between the Jewish NGO, the city of Warsaw, and the Ministry of Culture and National Heritage. Because of that governance structure, even though it's now a state museum, because of that governance structure, that Jewish NGO plays a very important role. And so, most importantly, it means that the Minister of Culture cannot unilaterally hire or fire the director. That decision has to be made as a consensus among the 3 parties. They have to reach a consensus. So, and there are other aspects. The NGO raises funds for the museum, which gives it a little bit of greater autonomy or independence that it would have if it were dependent completely on the ministry. So it is, that's the first thing. The second is that there is enormous international support for the museum, enormous. There are distinguished benefactors who are very devoted to the museum, primarily in the US, understandably, but not only, also in Poland and also in Israel. And the museum has a huge reputation. We won the 2016 European Museum of the Year Award, which is the top award for any museum in Europe. It was the first time any museum in Poland ever won that award, and is the only time that any museum has won that award. So the international standing of the museum, I would say that the core exhibition, which is what I was responsible for as chief curator, and I worked with a wonderful team of academics and curators, designers. I think that it has not been, it hasn't been particularly controversial, at least not yet. And we opened in 2014. But our public programs and our temporary exhibitions do confront very difficult topics in a very, I would say, fearless way: anti-Semitism, Holocaust, etc. So there is, on the part of the current right-wing government, there is pushback. They're not happy with our temporary exhibitions and public programs, but they're quite happy with a lot of other aspects of what we do, and that we are overall internationally very good for Poland. but in terms of domestic politics, not so good. So because the ministry's historical policy is to, quote, defend the good name of Poland, and that is not the mission of a reputable museum of public history, which is what we are. So internally, in terms of domestic politics, when we do present difficult topics like the March 68 anti-Semitic campaign that was communist government sponsored, or we do programs that address the violence of Polish neighbors against their Jewish neighbors, then the sort of extreme right wing, yells anti-Polish, 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 but that doesn't have any resonance whatsoever internationally outside of Poland. So there's a kind of a schizophrenia where outside of Poland, when President Duda goes to Israel and he's asked about anti-Semitism, he says, "What do you mean anti-Semitism? Look at our beautiful Jewish museum." So it plays very well internationally. But internally, as part of the internal politics, it's a different story. So the short answer is I'm not worried.
That's good to hear. It's good to hear. Some people are wondering about the relationship between Yiddish and Polish language. I noticed, for example, in your father's paintings, he even later remembered the Polish names for the street signs or the shop names and things. And somebody else asked about the ratio of Yiddish to Hebrew to Polish in the autobiographies. Could you talk just a little bit about the language issue?
Sure. I think that, if I'm not mistaken, most of the autobiographies in Yiddish, and then the next language would be Polish, and the third would be Hebrew. And they were not just from Poland. They were also from, just Eastern Europe more generally. So they were also like from Latvia, what is today, and even what was then Lithuania, Ukraine. So they're from the region. They're from what we often call the historical territory of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So they're from the sort of Yiddish-speaking Eastern Europe, I would say, for the most part. But even though they came in other languages, and they could write in any language they wanted, it was okay. They could write in any language. So, so first of all, about my father, he was enormously proud of his Polish. He just was so proud. And because he left Poland in 34, when I brought him back to, we came back to Poland and we visited and he would speak Polish, people were really charmed by it because it sounded old fashioned. It hadn't really been updated, even though he used it every day in his business because he was in an immigrant neighborhood in Toronto with Ukrainian, Polish, German, but usually mainly Ukrainian and Polish immigrants. So he was speaking Polish all the time, also with his friends from the old country. They spoke Polish all the time. So he was very, very, very proud of his Polish. And my mother also, their greatest goal in life was to speak English without an accent. So they were language proud. These are multilingual people who take enormous pride in speaking a language well, enormous pride. So he could quote, he memorized the opening, stanzas of Pantadeusz, the Polish national epic. And he loved it. He could recite it because, of course, recitation was a big thing in the old country. So, and of course, he went to Polish public school for 7 years. So his Polish was really excellent, very, very excellent. And of course, they spoke Yiddish at home. And he learned Hebrew for Cheder, and of course he knew how to pray in Hebrew and read. But I would say that it was the kids that went to the Tarbut schools that actually learned Hebrew and really, or came from Zionist families where the family itself was very invested in modern Hebrew and spoke Hebrew to their kids at home. So, you had that as well. So you had a very, very multilingual. And they're operating, and you have writers that are operating in all the languages. They're writing in Hebrew, Russian, Polish, German, Yiddish. It's a really, really diverse, very diverse, Jewishly diverse and generally diverse situation, language and culture.
I think people often forget, right, about the possibility that people can have multiple languages, and it's not just this one-on-one relationship between language and culture, right? It's a little bit more complicated than that.
I have to tell you, it's the curse of English speakers that, particularly those that live on an island with no borders. although there are other languages there, like Doric and Scot and Irish and Welsh. There are some other languages there, in addition to immigrants, of course.
I see a particular terminological question here that may be of interest to people. This idea of this term defensive modernization, which you used. The questioner asked, is that your own term, defensive modernization? You said maybe that extrospective might be your word, but
I wish I'd come up with it. I'm not sure who came up with it, but I know that I inherited it from my very, very dear colleague, Marcin Wojcinski, a wonderful, wonderful historian at the University of Wrocław. And he's a 19th century historian of Polish Jews, especially Hasidism and the relationship.
Marcin Wojcinski?
Yeah.
Yes, he was a Yedlin lecturer just a couple of years ago. So
he's fabulous. You got to bring him back.
2016, our 2016 Yedlin lecturer.
Oh, you got to bring him back. He just published this extraordinary Atlas of Hasidism. You've got a great lineup of lectures.
Well, I mean, it can only go downhill from now, right? I mean, this is.
Wow, I am in the best possible company. Natalie Davis, Marcin Wojcinski. I mean, you can't do better.
We work closely with the University of Wrocław and their Institute for Jewish Studies. That's one of our partners. The University of Alberta and University of Wrocław are partner universities.
Absolutely. He's developing a premier Jewish studies program. He's just at a beautiful facility that the university gave him. And he's just doing great.
He gave me a tour last time I was there, and the conference room, he said, was the conference room the German officers used in the defense of Festung Breslau, right? It is so ironic and so great that room, that he has a picture of like these generals, these German generals with their maps trying to defend godforsaken Breslau. And this is now the conference room of the Jewish Studies Center of Wrocław.
Absolutely. That's exactly. I mean, it's really it's extraordinary. So I'll tell you how it came up. So when we were working on the long 19th century, so even like you can even say 1792, because it's like three times partitioning.
The third partition,
all the way to World War I. We got the long 19th century because it extends from the 18th to the 20th. And we were calling that gallery Encounters with Modernity. And we were looking at the range of ways that Jews responded to those challenges. And one of the ways was what Marcin called, and I'm not sure where he took it from, defensive modernization. So, and it was particularly useful when presenting the modern yeshiva. In other words, it wasn't that you modernize by jettisoning the yeshiva. You modernize by creating a new kind of yeshiva. So where the old yeshiva trained rabbis who would then make a living with what they had learned and would be able primarily to adjudicate on matters of religious law and ritual law. That was their main job. Now, the modern yeshiva, inspired by the Vilna Gaon, would valorize study for its own sake, the study of Torah for its own sake, not as a tool for making a living. And it would be private rather than communal. So it would be independent, and ideally, which is how it started, it would be funded privately so that these students wouldn't be so destitute that it would be a kind of degrading of their value and of the value of their dedication to studying Torah 24 hours, 24/7, basically. So that was, and actually Hasidism could be seen in those terms as well. And the Bes Yankov schools for girls could be seen in that way as well. In other words, it's a way that I would say this, that the defending of tradition creates something new. That's what happened.
We have actually a posting from Warsaw, from Krakow, talking about this particular issue that Sarah Schreiner established the Beis Yaakov, and this poster thinks the defensive modernism was tied to that, right?
Absolutely.
In Orthodoxy. So thank you from Krakow. We also have not just Costa Rica on board, Costa Rica in the house, but Krakow in the house as well. there's a technical question about how the documents were posted to YIVO. You said the envelopes were saved and kids who didn't have the funds were offered the opportunity to participate in other stories. I guess, could you talk just a little bit more about the?
So I think that it was very clever that they saved the envelopes, because it was the only, it was a way for them to see where it was mailed from. I'm assuming there's a return address on it. And if there was a return address, it would mean that if they needed to get in touch with the person, they conceivably they could, although I don't think they, oh, I know, with the return address, they would be able to send the prize to the winner.
Of course.
For example. So I'm not sure if YIVO sent stamps to the kids because it's one thing to send a postcard, another thing to send a notebook. So I don't know if, I wouldn't be surprised if YIVO didn't mail them the stamps to be able to send the notebook. But I see the thing here. It says how the documents were posted. So they were mailed for sure. And envelopes, they saved the envelopes because they kept the notebooks in the envelopes. I think YIVO might have sent them the stamps, but I'm not sure. And actually, some of these autobiographers were tracked down and were willing to be open about who they were. And there's all kinds of stories about them. I think some of them are in Awakening Lives. I think some of them might be in that book.
Well, we have somebody posting here that says, yes, they were autobiographies. I guess this goes back to the question about YIVO and the translations and the diaries. Somebody says, I helped translate one of them. So humbling to be part of this project. So this, I guess, goes back to the question about the current translation issues. Well, everybody should be remembered. YIVO is an ongoing concern. They're doing stuff, right?
There's still, a lot of absolutely. And in fact, this most recent one that was found in Vilnius, that they had the photograph of the girl. I mean, I think it's also so interesting which ones wanted to actually present themselves as real people with their name, their photograph, which ones did these elaborate drawings on the front, because they, I'll tell you what it is. The YIVO's approach of Zamlin, of collecting, and of the army of collectors, of ordinary people, I think there was a sense of mission that YIVO was a very inspiring institution. Keep in mind, it's established in 1925 and they ran the first autobiography contest about 5 or 6 years later. It's a very, very young institution, and they felt they were contributing to a mission, that they were helping to create a monument to their lives, their towns, their culture, their language. And even if they were workers, and even if they never got past public school, there was a sense of mission and participation. It was, I'll tell you, in terms of contemporary museology and engaging communities, this is the gold standard. This is the gold standard. That, this is just saying, this is your university without a state. This is your monument, and you are making it, and you are contributing to it, and it is about you, and it is for you, and it is by you. I mean, that is the gold standard.
Well, I'm looking at the questions and answers. I think it looks like we're coming to an end of the question period. I don't know, Barb, would you like to say any closing remarks? Or, I guess I'll say some closing remarks, but I'll let you say some closing remarks before my closing remarks.
I would say, just that, I would just say what a pleasure it has been for me to share this material with you. And I know that under these pandemic conditions, many people are, as we say in Yiddish, ausgezoomt, that they are zoomed out. So I never take for granted people's willingness to take the time and spend this hour and a half with us. So I thank all of you who did that, and I especially thank you, Joseph, for this wonderful invitation and for being in such superb company.
Well, I think I heard you, and it's on tape. that you said you'd like to talk more about the foundation of the museum and the history of the museum. And as somebody interested in public history and museology and all, I might call you back on that one.
I'm ready.
We might get you up to Edmonton yet. I don't know. We'll see.
I'm ready.
Okay. Well, I'm sorry for today. I think that's going to be it for our presentation. My gratitude goes out to you, Barbara, for participating, for accepting our invitation. I appreciate it, and I hope we can continue the relationship and work more with you. I want to remind everybody in the future that this is only step 1 of 3, or event 1 of 3 in the Jewish Studies Week this term at the University of Alberta. Tomorrow, the Bellsberg lecturer in Jewish Studies here, Peter Sabo, has invited Vered Weiss of the Department of Jewish Studies at San Francisco State University to give a talk. So if you're not ausgetoomt, if you want to, come to another talk tomorrow, Dr. Weiss will be giving a lecture called Judah and the New Jew, Undead Jewish Israeli Identities. That's going to be at the same time at 3 o'clock here on the Mountain Time. For those of you in Costa Rica or in Poland, you'll have to do the math, but we'll be at 3 o'clock here. And then on Thursday, we have the third of our Jewish Studies Week presentations when Lisa Silverman of the University of Wisconsin at Milwaukee is going to be giving a talk about Jewish spaces in Vienna before 1938, which I think will fit very well in with some of the themes that Dr. Kirshenblatt-Gimblett introduced us to today. And maybe I think one final thing that came up, the YIVO Institute will be participating in the social media campaign to commemorate the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And if you'd like to help participate in this campaign or this commemoration, we'll post information to our website and to our social media about that as well. So enough of all that. Thanks again to all the people out there and to you, Barbara, for participating, and hopefully we'll see everybody tomorrow.